So good morning, Randy. Jeff Jackson here with Randy Welch this morning, folks. And so Randy and I've had Randy, it's been, I don't know, 18 years that we've been bouncing around the country together looking at stuff. Started when you came out to help me as an ag retailer and do some meetings and learn a few things, and all quickly turned into one of my mentors. And here we are today.
All these years later, we're still together, Jeff. So that's pretty exciting to have worked all these years and just pretty much focusing on alfalfa. So it's been fantastic.
Absolutely. I want to throw out a conversation topic to you today, Randy. So we've had a few phone calls this winter that may be a little bit concerning, if you will, and it comes down to I'm going to call it winter seeding or dormant seeding of alfalfa. We've discussed this a little bit already. We've had discussions for a long time about it, but Randy, do you think there may be a little bit of confusion on using alfalfa as a successful winter seeded crop and maybe clovers, and where this has gone and what we need to be aware of?
Yeah, I think that's the point right there. Is I think a lot of times farmers get confused on the clover frost seeding and alfalfa in frost seeding. So the technical part of this is that alfalfa is the warmest of the legumes, the forage legumes. So we want to be make it a clear distinction between clovers, which would be the white clover and red clover, which frost seed fairly well, compared to our alfalfa, which does not frost seed very well. So the seedlings will, if they sprout, they will basically succumb to the weather. And what happens is the seedlings die before they actually, alfalfa seedlings will die before they establish. On the other hand, the clover, being a more cold tolerant species, both white clover and red clover will tolerate colder temperatures and germinate very well at cold temperatures and just seem to establish better. In fact, in our wheat growing part of the eastern U.S., typical application of red clover quite often happens in our wheat seedings, and guys will put clover down, and we've had producers try alfalfa with complete failure. So the point would be is that clovers work well, alfalfa does not work well for these frost seedings, which would include either an early spring seeding, just to make this point on your question today, is
Yeah.
that the fall seedings would be the same dilemma that you have with these early spring seedings, is that it's just not the appropriate time to plant alfalfa in these cooler, less than ideal conditions, which would be these fall seedings, which would not be recommended, or even ultra early spring seedings, which would not be recommended for alfalfa.
And I just want to clarify too. So I heard you say fall seeding. Now somebody's probably going to get a little confused when you said that, because they might call it fall seeding in one area, and we might call it late summer seedings in a different area, Randy. So let's throw a calendar date to that so people can clarify a little bit. So you and I have talked about late summer seedings, and that would be what, August
Yeah,
15th through
yes,
early September.
yeah. So you just have to, look on the calendar and look on the map where you're at. So I mean,
Right.
the listeners in this discussion here are going to be across the country potentially, but generally we start in the northern U.S. for fall seedings. Ideally, we want to have alfalfa. We want to have enough time on the calendar so that alfalfa gets somewhere around 6 to 8 inches of growth before we get a hard frost going into the fall. So generally, where I like to start this discussion would be at St. Cloud, Minnesota. We generally like to start our fall seedings in probably mid to last week of July at the latest. So if you start at the northern dairy region there at St. Cloud, Minnesota, you'd start in July. And then as you go south in the U.S., you just keep adding on days and weeks. And then by the
Correct.
time to get to where you're at, and Jeff, your area, Kansas City, Jeff, what would you call a typical date at Kansas City for a fall seeding?
I tell you what, so my general time frame would probably be about the 15th of September. And then we have years like this, Randy, where it stayed nice, and a person could have got by if you had your crystal ball and you could hit it 100%. Shoot, we could have seeded alfalfa all the way out through middle of October, because we just froze hard and stayed cold here just the other day. So
Yeah. So the key thing that we need to remember with what we call fall seedings, and this is separate from the topic about this ultra late frost seeding that we're also
right.
talking about in this discussion. The key thing you want to remember is that alfalfa needs to go through a process called contractile growth. And
Yes.
contractile growth is really important because it basically is a stage of growth in alfalfa, and other perennial plants have this same process as well. But the alfalfa goes through this process of contractile growth, and it's really a transition between the alfalfa being annual to perennial. And that's
Correct.
really important because until that alfalfa is about 6 to 8 inches tall, it still is an annual. So when it gets really cold and it gets, soil temperatures start to drop and air temperatures start to drop, and that crown is not formed, then you're going to end up with a plant that's still an annual if it's less than 6 to 8 inches tall, and it's most likely to die and freeze in cold temperatures, and we obviously lose that stand or lose those plants within that stand. Then you have a thin stand, then you have got tough decisions the next spring. What do you do to fix it?
Now,
So we
can
want to
we?
just make sure you're thinking about that size of that plant, the temperature that you just mentioned, as far as every year is slightly different, of course, but you
Yes.
want to have in the back of your mind, you want to plant it earlier, not later. And a lot of times farmers will say, well, I did this, I planted pretty late last year and I got by with it. And then the next year, of course, you have different weather conditions and it
Correct.
doesn't work. So just be aware of that there are guidelines and we need to try to follow those the best we can.
So this winter seeding dormant thing, and the way I describe it to people, Randy, too, is one thing that makes me the most nervous is we get these little, I'm going to call them Indian Springs in the middle of nowhere where we might warm up. We're shallow seeding this alfalfa seed, right? And there might be times where there's no snow cover, and we get fairly warm for a few days in the 60s even, and we get that top to melt, and we imbibe a bunch of moisture, and we get that seed all swelled up and ready to germ, or maybe it has a couple days and it does germ, and then all of a sudden we go back down to 14 degrees for 2 weeks. So we've just basically killed that
Yeah,
seed
yeah, you've
and
killed
or
that
any
seed.
seedling that had any chance. And
Right.
and we see that quite frequently where we might have no snow cover and it could do these kind of things. So that's one thing that makes me the most nervous. Now, I did do a little bit of scouting before we got on this phone call today. I found a study. So I'm gonna throw this out there. There was a paper written by Kansas State University in 1994. Excuse me, they did the work from 94, 95, and 96. And they planted alfalfa on, yeah, February, March, April, and May. So 4 months in a row. And what they found on average is that when it was 34 degrees outside, it would, excuse me, 34 degree soil temperature or outside, it would take 15 days to get 50% of those seedlings to germinate or seeds to germinate. Once it got to 50 degrees, it took 3 days to get 50% to germinate. And we all know that if you had the most ideal conditions, you could have 65 to 70 degree soil temperature and it would be tremendous. So people need to consider that. What happens to that seedling, Randy, also? Oh, and their data would suggest that February 1st, only 6% of the seedlings survived. Okay.
Right.
March 1st seeding, 10% survived. April 1st, 28% survived. And on May 1st, literally, they had 36% of the seed that was planted that germinated and grew into live, healthy plants. So the message still to me says what we already know. The warmer the soil you get, the better conditions you have, the more seed you will have that will be viable plants once the growing season starts, right?
I mean, one of the ways I like to think about this, talking to farmers about, in a farmer discussion with this idea, I think our jobs as advisors, as the agronomy advisor on a farm, is to help a farmer minimize his risk, not to maximize his risk, right? So if you
Correct.
think of if you think about what we're doing, what the farmer's doing to himself, he is putting himself in a maximum risk situation, which means that he's going to go to the effort to put the seed out there. He's going to put that seed in a very stressful condition. The numbers you just rattled off there are exactly what I would suspect. And then he's going to have to come back out there next spring and make a tough decision, or we're going to have to make a tough decision with him. You tear this stand up, which is quite often what we would need to do, and simply start over with your April, May seeding, which is the ideal time to plant alfalfa when we have higher soil temperatures. I think from a risk standpoint, we're better off just to wait until the conditions are appropriate, the soil temperatures are up where they need to be, have adequate moisture, We minimize disease pressures, of course. I mean, there's a lot of things that happen in the spring of the year that help that alfalfa stand get a good start rather than putting them out there when we're in cold and less than ideal conditions for germination.
So this crop is no different than the other seed crops that we plant from that perspective. We always talk about a certain soil temperature to get good germination and vigor out of corn. We need a certain temperature to get good germination and vigor out of soybeans. And we follow that to the nth degree. So let's not make an exception today on alfalfa, Randy, and say, oh, it'll be just fine. I think that's a problem that we get a lot, is that people assume it's going to be just fine. And we have, what happens to the stress of that plant? Let's just say some of it does germinate and it starts to grow, and it takes 15 days for this process to happen. What's the vigor and the health of that plant once it gets out of the ground?
Yeah, and you're gonna have a thin stand. You're only gonna have a small percentage, like you've already said. You're just gonna have a poor stand, and then we're gonna have to come back in there next spring and put more seed in it anyway. So why put yourself through that agony of reseeding if you know that you're gonna put yourself in a bad spot right to start with? So it would not be a best management practice that we'd recommend.
I think we've come to that agreement too, that we concur that to anybody that is considering doing a winter seeding, frost seeding type scenario with alfalfa, we don't consider that a best management practice. Your risk is very high. Your success rate is very low. So let's shoot for a part of the year, because the reason everybody's trying to do this is to get ahead, right? We want to have seed in the ground. We want to have it started as soon as it can. But literally, with our experiences across the industry, I would say we could have this discussion with 50 industry professionals and we probably come up with the same conclusion, that it's not the best practice. Most likely you will have a weak, thin, or poor stand and have to redo it anyway. So now you have extra cost and expense and time and labor that goes into that project.
Then the other thing just to add here, I think, is with modern equipment and modern techniques. I mean, most of our drills now our equipment is getting very large and we can cover a lot of acreage in a hurry. You know, the time involved to do it right and the time involved to do it wrong are basically exactly the same amount of equipment time. So let's put the equipment to the acre when that soil condition is proper, temperature wise and moisture wise, to get that stand to a great start. So
right on. What would be a couple of the other hot topics that we want to make people aware of as we're talking about getting a new stand started and having a good start to the process? Is there anything that kind of hits the top of your mind?
You bet. So one of the things that comes to mind this year is our dry conditions across the upper Midwest in particular. And certainly the western U.S. was we were terrible dry. If you kind of look at a line from basically Wisconsin west, we had areas that were far below normal rainfall. And so one of the things that comes to mind right away is that we're changing our herbicide programs in our corn and soybean to control difficult these herbicide-resistant weeds as we've moved away from a solely Roundup-ready herbicide program in corn and beans and adding more residual chemistries. My concern is, and we're seeing this on a lot of farms right now, where we have the risk of carryover on some of these compounds is becoming more significant. And what my concern is that because we've had dry conditions in much of the upper Midwest, and we've used some of these chemistries that have longer residual times in terms of controlling water hemp and some of these other difficult weeds, we're ramping this chemistry up, and so the likelihood of having herbicide carryover is pretty high. If you read the labels on some of these compounds, I won't get real specific on this, but some of the compounds will say about 15 inches of rain is kind of where the break point is. And I think we were real close in much of the central and western U.S. where we did not have 15 inches of rain during the growing season. So that would be a concern right away. So one of the management topics that I've kind of hit on with a lot of growers here in my region that I cover is that I think our tillage systems have an influence on the amount of herbicide carryover damage. And this may be a year where, and I hate to say this, but this may be a year where we want to do just a little bit of tillage. The old saying is dilution is the solution to pollution, right? So if we can do a little bit of tillage and just move that herbicide barrier around just a little bit so that you're not planting directly into that residual herbicide, it may benefit alfalfa quite a bit. So, Jeff, you and I have talked about over the last few years here Sometimes the farmer will come to us and say, my alfalfa is just not looking quite right out there in the fields. It looks
Yeah.
uneven. It's spotty. I got thin spots. It just doesn't seem to be growing. I planted it, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and I just don't, what's wrong with that alfalfa? And many times, what we found is it's herbicide carryover from a corn application, herbicide application from the previous year, or soybean herbicide in some cases, or even wheat. Some of the wheat
Yep.
chemistries now are giving us a potentially residual activity. And these compounds are designed to kill plants. We sometimes think that herbicides are designed to only kill weeds, but they will influence your crop. In the case of alfalfa, the herbicide doesn't know whether it's killing a weed or an alfalfa seedling. So you just need to think that through a little bit. If you have a herbicide that's laying on top, maybe dilution of that chemistry with a little bit of tillage can help us to get that alfalfa off to a good start this year.
Yeah, I think that's a big key piece, and they need to start look at, again, if you read the labels carefully, they will talk about organic matter levels, soil pHs, soil textures being clays versus coarse soils, how much rainfall you might need, tillage to help, if you will, break down, stir up, dilute, all those little things. I think you're right are going to make an impact on it. And to your example earlier, Randy, that's probably the most devastating alfalfa stand to have, is the one that is underperforming that we don't really know why. And I think there's been a lot of stands that have been left that way over the last number of years, where they germinate, they emerge, things kind of look okay, so we leave them, and then we're just not thrilled with the yield that we're getting, and we're thinking, man, what's going on with these new genetics today? I thought they were supposed to be better, and I used to get fields that yielded better than this. I don't know how many times I've heard that comment. And
Right.
then we go do some more investigation or dig some roots, follow the paper trail backwards, and go, oh yeah, we probably had enough that affected the plant, but it didn't kill the plant, and therefore we have an underperforming alfalfa stand. I think that's more common than we'd like to admit right now.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Jeff. Is that we simultaneously introduced some our new alfalfa technologies right at the same time that a lot of these new chemistries are coming out to control difficult weeds in corn and soybeans and wheat.
Right.
So the timing is really interesting from a bad standpoint of how lots of times farmers are blaming the alfalfa for a chemistry problem that's really hurting the field. The one little scouting thing that I would like to mention is, as we talk about this herbicide carryover, and you mentioned a really key point there on the organic matter. Anywhere you have lower organic matter, it's more likely that you're going to have a higher risk of herbicide carryover. So what I've found in my territory is I've worked with growers now in the last 3 to 4 years on this herbicide carryover topic. You want to make sure that you're checking if you suspect a herbicide carryover situation, it will usually happen on the lower organic matter areas of the field. And so if you see really good alfalfa on the low ground where you have higher organic matter, the 2, 3, 4% organic matter, and then when you get to that 2% or less organic matter on hillsides or knolls or knobs or sandy areas of the field where you see slower growing alfalfa, that's quite typical of what you'll see with herbicide carryover. And that's based on the fact that the herbicide is not as readily tied up because you have less organic matter there. You basically have more activity sites, if you will, for that herbicide to influence and damage the alfalfa seedlings. So just always be checking for organic matter. And then you also mentioned soil texture. Would have an influence on that as well. So but the organic matter in particular, along the soil texture, the sandy soils would be more likely to have herbicide carryover because you have more activity of that leftover chemistry.
My ask for everybody out there is that if you're in a situation where you start looking at the details and somebody says, oh, it should be okay, that word should is a caution sign for me that I run the other way. If somebody says it should be okay, I'd rather have a definite and say, oh, you've been 2 years out, it will be fine. That's a whole different. Every time somebody uses a little bit of that wish-washy, oh, I think you'll be okay. No, you're probably not. Let's just make another plan. Try to find another field, make the best rotational decision you can. Because, Randy, some of these things, if you look at those things, it says 2 cropping seasons.
Right.
Let's not cut that thing short and assume that we're going to be fine. And
Right.
so I'd much rather have a person have a success than a half a stand and have a failure.
Right. So in some of these labels, it's pretty clear on alfalfa is that if you have less than 2% organic matter, it's 18 months from the day that you put that herbicide on there. If you're going to follow the label now, a lot of farmers, of course, may not follow that label, and if they're off label, right? So if you're planting alfalfa in with out that 18 months, you're breaking the label rules by putting alfalfa back on there. There's not a leg to stand on, so to speak, that, if you're putting alfalfa back in those fields. You just need to be aware of that. Herbicide carryover can be quite a concern on dry years, so everybody be aware.
In your comment, you referred to some newer varieties being introduced, almost at the same time we really started going from a glyphosate environment down to tank mixing and going back to residual herbicides. So what type of new varieties, or what spectrum has changed, or what was that big change that you referred to as going from
so there's
advancements?
There's some really neat technology in alfalfas that I think farmers are becoming more aware of, hopefully, and hopefully here at Cropland we've helped our producers to be aware of these new technologies. The first one that came out, the technology that really helped us with alfalfa establishment, was the Roundup Ready gene. And not that Roundup is new in corn and soybeans, but to some growers it's kind of a new, when you have a farmer that discovers Roundup Ready alfalfa for the first time, even after all these years, it's really kind of eye-opening how many alfalfa seedlings survive when you get the weed pressure away from them. That applies back to my wheat comment. Volunteer wheat can be a real problem for fall establishment of alfalfa. And we've had just a tremendous amount of our wheat growers that also are alfalfa growers that find that using Roundup Ready alfalfa in fall establishment, when you're short on water, there's nothing that helps alfalfa establish better than getting those weeds in the fall away from that alfalfa seedling. So Roundup Ready alfalfa in the fall establishment. Then, of course, now coming into spring, you want to be thinking about how am I going to control weeds, especially when we start talking about a lot of difficult weeds we have in these fields. That Roundup Ready alfalfa is still a valuable tool, even though, yes, we do have some Roundup resistant weeds in case of water hemp. We understand that. But you still have, as I like to say, 98% of the weeds or 99% of the weeds in your fields have not had the experience of being controlled by Roundup Ready alfalfa. The value of this technology, even though it sounds old, but it's really new to some producers, just be thinking about getting a good stand of alfalfa. We want to keep the weeds away from those alfalfa seedlings. Alfalfa seedlings hate to be in the shade, and they hate to be crowded, and they hate to be in competition with a weed. So anything we can do to get those weeds away in Roundup Ready technology is a great way to do that.
I want to step back, if you'll let me, just a second, because you hit on something that's caused me some great heartburn in the past. When we follow small grains with alfalfa in a late summer or fall seeded scenario, and people do not control those volunteers. Randy, I don't know how many times I've had a person call and say, I've got this really good cover crop of wheat or oats or whatever, that light grain that went through the combine. What should I do with that? My first comment today is make sure that it is dead. Because anytime you think, oh, I've got just this great cover crop, inevitably, Randy, right behind the combine where most of that grain falls, the next spring, we have weak, thin alfalfa stands because there's too much competition. Yes, it looks like a really neat, feel-good thing to have some, quote, cover crop or companion crop out there from that volunteer. But there's been a lot of stands where they are striped alfalfa fields the next spring because that pressure is too great, too much competition in those strips. So I like to let people know that, again, if you spray if you have your Roundup Ready alfalfa planted, go out there. It's easy to kill at that point. Get rid of the other fall biennial weeds at the same time. Kill that quote unquote cover crop. Don't let it go because we have too much competition. And it's a bad day when you have to go out there and reseed 8-foot strips behind the combine all the way across the field.
Yeah, that fall competition is just deadly to alfalfa. Remember, you only have so many heat units left in the fall, and every day that goes by, those little seedlings are fighting for existence. In that cover crop competition is damaging to that alfalfa during establishment. The other thing, just not go too far on this, more on this Roundup, but Roundup, I hear a lot of producers say, well, I'll just use some select or post-plas section, those type of chemistries. Those chemistries are okay, but they're not great. There's nothing better than Roundup on these grassy type weeds. I mean, it does just a wonderful job cleaning up those grassy type competitive weeds in the fall of the year, along with what you just mentioned, Jeff, is a great point, is all the winter annuals. And the winter
Yeah.
annuals would be things like, depending upon where you are listening to these comments, but yellow rocket, we're getting a lot of chickweed coming in a lot of the Midwest now, henbit, any of these weeds that germinate, pennycress, shepherd's purse, those are all what we call winter annuals.
The little
And
yellow one called dandelion,
well, and that'll germinate in the fall. Yes, that one germinates in the fall. So
thistles.
there's just a whole bunch
Yep.
of them that you can take care of with a fall application of Roundup. It's just a technology that we just, as producers, have learned to use it. The farmers that have it absolutely love it. So
Right
then
on.
the next technology I just want to mention to you briefly is that the Harv Extra technology, which is a modification in the way that the alfalfa plant makes lignin. And lignin is the digestion process of alfalfa and forages, in particular in dairy animals. The animal's digestion system is only so big. And as you put more and more forage into that animal, if that forage is not digestible, it is less and less likely to make more milk. So in the case of dairy animals, we've introduced a new alfalfa now that has a new gene in alfalfa that reduces the lignin and, more importantly, makes the cellulose and the hemicellulose, or the digestible portion of that alfalfa, higher, so it becomes more valuable to the animal as a fiber source and a nutrient source, not just rough material going through the animals as a roughage, right? So this Harv Extra trait is beneficial from a digestion standpoint, but it's also really important for a management trait. And so
Yes.
what it allows us to do is actually cut the alfalfa a few days later. And this is the one thing we've learned the last 3-4 years now we've worked with this, the Harv Extra trait, is it allows us to cut the alfalfa 3 to 5 days later. What that does is, rather than cutting alfalfa every 22 to 25 days, which a lot of high quality dairy producers were trying to do, it
Yes.
allows us to go back to these 28 to 32 day cuttings, allows us to stretch these cuttings out a little bit and still get equal or better forage quality and get more alfalfa yield. And the neat thing about Harv Extra is that for every day that we did some research on this with University of Wisconsin, we actually found that alfalfa grows at about 1 inch per day if you have heat and water. 1 inch per day. Each inch of alfalfa is worth about 125 pounds of dry matter if you have 50 stems
Yeah.
in your stand density. If you think about the math on that just for a second, you think about adding 3 to 5 days on each cutting, you're adding a tremendous amount of yield, and you're also, and here's the real kicker on this that we really think is important, is that you're adding that extra time on the end of the season. Rather than
Yes.
taking your final cutting in the middle of August, we're taking our final cutting at the very end of August. If you add on those 3 to 5, maybe 7 days, depending upon your exact calendar sequencing. The thing that you're adding on is another 10 days of growth in the fall of the year, which adds perfect timing. And you, Jeff, you just made a really interesting statement in one of your previous comments, is that, maybe our weather is getting warmer. Who knows? It seems like our falls are getting nicer. I mean, we probably can push these cuttings back out to September 1 in most of the upper Midwest, and UW here in Wisconsin has been talking about basically going to September 5. The point would be, is with Harv Extra, it allows you to get that cutting out there just a little bit later, still have equal or a very good forage quality, and then to add more yield on, like I said, at that 125 pounds of dry matter per day. That is a significant value to growers using that technology to add that extra yield to their alfalfa, and give them more management options. If it's going to rain that particular stretch of weather that you're planning on cutting your alfalfa, now you can add on that 3 to 5 days and not worry about getting on the backside of that weather system coming through at your farm.
So the other thing, Randy, let's just say that I've got a solar panel outside hooked up to a battery and it's trickle charging that thing. If I let it sit out in the sun and trickle charge 3 to 5 days longer, what happens to the energy that's stored in that battery? It goes up. So if I can have my alfalfa out there in full plumage, I'm going to call it plumage today, with full vegetative growth grabbing free sunlight to make energy, I can store a little bit more carbohydrate in that root system to make better regrowth, better plant health, all those kind of things. So those extra 3 to 5 days in between cuts, from a plant physiology standpoint, I think is probably as tremendous of an opportunity as some are going to get, because like you said, cutting every 22 days, how much energy is actually stored in that root system versus what we can gain in another 3 to 5.
The physiology on that, interesting you mentioned that, is that we really don't get much growth. We mentioned before that 6 to 8 inches is that you probably don't get much energy going back into that alfalfa plant until it gets about a foot tall. And then if you look at every day that plant's out there, to your point,
yes,
Jeff, adding on those extra days in that growth cycle is a tremendous. I mean, you think about it from a plant standpoint, you built all this factory, you have all these leaves out there, you have all this stem, the factory is there. And then we as people come along and cut that plant off right about when it's ready to start putting a lot of energy into its roots. The value of, we don't think of it maybe this way, but a lot of our winter kill, a lot of our damage on alfalfa sometimes happens because we cut this alfalfa so aggressively in the middle of the season that it just never gets a chance to actually lay down any carbohydrates or energy to live through the winter. So that's a great point, Jeff.
Okay, now I'm going to go another step, because we've talked about delaying a cut. So we have some people or parts of the country that were intensive 4 cuts or intensive 5 cuts. If you do the math on this thing and you're doing 5 cuts and you add 3 to 5 days, I mean, literally, Randy, you could go from a 5-cut scenario down to 4-cut scenario. And so now we've just said that by leaving those extra days, we can get more carbohydrates, we can have a healthier plant. There's this thing called wheel traffic and compaction that we just reduced 1 cutting, which would be a mowing, a merging, a harvest. First of all, there's plant health that we've improved. We're not going to have all that extra wheel traffic, but think about we're in this environment today where we can reduce fuel consumption, and we could talk about carbon and expenses, but literally harvest cost and that extra wheel traffic, if you can reduce a cutting and go from 5 to 4 or from 4 to 3, take that tonnage in each cut, have a healthier plant, less input cost. I think there's a lot of different win-win-win scenarios that come with this Harvextra technology.
Yeah, it in some parts of the country where you're in that tweener land, as I call it, between a 3-cut and 4-cut, or 4-cut and 5-cut, or wherever you're listening to this message, there's places in the country where we're probably pushing that envelope just a little too aggressively on the alfalfa.
Correct.
It's hurting the yield, it's hurting the stand persistence. So the Harvextra trait may help some growers in those bands, if you will, where we're in that difficult transition. And there's a lot of cases where we're probably pushing just a little too hard on our cutting. We're cutting a little too aggressively. We're trying to add that extra cutting. And, the data is really, really interesting on this, is that you do not get more alfalfa by taking an extra cutting. And so when, Grandpa was a little bit wrong on this statement, is that he always said, well, just take an extra cutting, you'll get more alfalfa. That's not the case. The data actually bears out that if you take an extra cutting and you hurt that alfalfa, you actually reduce the yield, or your total yield is actually. And if you add the economics, which you just kind of alluded to a little bit there, the economics of the fuel cost, the compaction, all the extra labor, you lose money by taking that extra cutting in many cases. So the point would be with Harvextra, you can stretch these harvests out a little bit, get equal or slightly better forage quality, have reduced harvest cost potentially, have more yield, better stand persistence, and it's all around better for the alfalfa.
And then, so we didn't even talk about weather events yet. So let's say that you are planning to cut your Harvextra on a 28-day schedule, and you get some weather that moves through, and it pushes you out to 30, 32 days. Harvextra versus a regular variety without that trait. Now we have the extra quality to get us through that weather event. Maybe it's a major breakdown, something like that, or a family emergency, and you've got to be away from the farm for a few days. All of those kind of things really help ease the burden, ease the risk. It's going to take that risk level down of going from really good hay to less than desirable quality. So that's another nice little benefit, is it gives you that flexibility to maneuver that cutting where it fits that month, that sequence, however your operation goes.
Right. Yeah, it's just a wonderful technology to help us to get higher quality alfalfa. So much of the development of alfalfa over the last, let's say 30 years has been about more yield. And then Harvextra really kind of breaks that mold a little bit, that it actually
Yeah.
focuses on forage quality in addition to yield. So, yeah.
Well, that's great. And then on top of that, there have been some other really, really neat major advancements. So we've got the traits themselves, and then we've taken that thing and went the next step farther and improved some plant health pieces.
Yeah, so that's been really outstanding. Is that if you think about the traits that I just mentioned, and now the important part about building whether it's a tractor or car or some type of mechanical device, you have to think about all the pieces that come together, right? So
Yep.
just because you have a good engine and transmission, you need tires and brakes and wheels and all the things that come together and equipment. That's kind of like alfalfa. If you think about putting the whole package together, the piece of machinery. The piece of machinery here is to think about, you need a good base that you're going to add these other features onto. And the base is disease resistance in our new varieties. So we have a new product line that we've actually introduced this last couple years here called Double A. And Double A stands for, my joke is absolutely awesome, but it really stands for Aphanomyces resistance and anthracnose resistance.
Right.
Two diseases of alfalfa that cause a lot of concern for alfalfa breeders and growers alike is these two diseases. And Aphanomyces is a wet soil disease. There's several races of this disease, and so we're really on to the race 2/3, it's been called, or race other. But there's basically these other pests, pathogens in the soil that hurt alfalfa, certainly during establishment and then also potentially through the life of the stand. These disease resistance mechanisms help us to get better roots, and why this is important is that you get better roots, you get healthier roots, you get more rhizobium bacteria that form nodules on the roots. That means you get more nitrogen produced. That means the plant is healthier, it's going to have more energy. This whole thing about healthy roots are so important to high yield alfalfa. The first A in the Double A stands for Aphanomyces resistance, and it's not just the first race, not just the second, but there's actually a third race, or a race other, like we like to call it, or race 2/3, or this cocktail, as the plant breeders like to call it, of these wet soil diseases that we're selecting for tremendous disease resistance. So that would be the first A in the Double A. And the other A in there is for anthracnose, and we've identified, or the plant breeders have identified, another potential race of anthracnose, race 5. And so anthracnose is basically a midlife disease of alfalfa. And so once the alfalfa establishes, it'll basically if it's susceptible, can succumb to a disease called anthracnose. And anthracnose is a stem and crown disease. Basically, what I like to say, goes into the pipeline of the stem, and it breaks the vascular flow of that stem, basically breaking down that phloem and xylem, and it breaks that pipeline down, and so that the plant cannot transport water and nutrients up and down the stem. And you've probably seen these as in your own fields as you listen to my comments here. As you walk around your alfalfa in the late summer, early fall, you'll see what's called a shepherd's crook. And that shepherd's crook will actually be a telltale sign that there's anthracnose expression in that field, and it'll be a plant here, a plant there, kind of scattered around. And then the other telltale sign is that you want to look very closely at that stem, and you'll see in that stem there'll be a diamond-shaped lesion, and that lesion goes, like I say, goes right to the pipeline. It's not on the surface. It does kill that stem and eventually kills that crown. So those plants that have resistance to those two diseases, both Aphanomyces and anthracnose, are more likely to have higher yields, better stand longevity, higher quality forage, have plants that are more persistent and going to give you a better result in your fields.
No, that's absolutely right. And I talk with people all the time too. And when you talked about the Aphanomyces piece, Randy, when you have a disease that basically is a root nibbler out there and will limit the number of roots that can be developed by that plant, I said, there's probably times where somebody has sent me a picture or asked me to go evaluate a field, and first glance you go, it looks like a fertility deficiency. Well, it probably is a fertility deficiency because there's not enough root system to pick up the nutrient the plant needs, or you might say, well, it looks like herbicide damage. Well, what's one of the damages that we have with herbicide? It prunes the roots off or won't let the plant grow effectively. So misdiagnosis can be a problem too. So just knowing that these varieties are out there, it's like many other crops. I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. So these varieties are available in many shapes, forms, and varieties today, whether it be conventional, straight Roundup Ready, or the new Harv Extra piece. Let's put it out there. And as you talked about the soil types, I'm going to throw this one in there because this is one of my valuable learnings too, is that we talked about diseases. And even in some of the drier environments where we might think you don't have that disease potential, we are actually seeing these new AA varieties be very, very, how do I want to say, they stick out like shining stars amongst everything else, even in an environment where you would assume that it doesn't have a disease. There's this overall plant health package that goes, I think, far beyond even Aphanomyces and Anthracnose through the screening process. We have done a tremendous amount of advancement in plant health in general. For example, all the way out through Western Kansas. That's not known as a moist soil, wet soil environment to have Aphanomyces out there, but we see an improvement all the way through some of these drier environments. So I'm going to encourage anyone that's
it's all about healthy roots, and the more
it is
healthy roots you have, the more water you can extract from the soil. A lot of this root research and disease resistance is about making roots healthier, bigger. The rhizobium thing, that's nitrogen is so important for alfalfa yield and quality. So, hey, another thing you hit on I thought was really interesting that I just wanted to mention quickly is that you can have two things going on in the field at the same time.
Oh yeah,
right. So the scouting 101 on this herbicide carryover. Back to that just a second. Is that you can have herbicide carryover, you could have wet soil disease, and you could have another little complication called soil compaction. And last spring, as I was training some interns, I was showing some students about, look in these wheel tracks. What do you see here? Well, you see really weak and thin alfalfa, or weaker, thinner alfalfa than over here where there's not wheel tracks. And so what would be going on here? Well, there could be several things going on. You could have the herbicide carryover being more pronounced in that area. You could have more disease from Aphanomyces in that area because of compaction. That's because two things could be happening is you're not letting the water go through that wheel track areas readily because you have soil compaction. The soil doesn't have as much airspace and you don't have downward movement of that water, but you also don't have downward movement of that water that's carrying that diluted herbicide out. So there's a lot of issues that can happen simultaneously in some of these scouting situations when you look side by side on compacted soils, disease showing disease resistance, and herbicide carryover can be happening in the same fields at the same time.
This leads me to another subject, and you're probably, it's kind of fun how this all tails one thing into the next. I made a comment a little earlier about having damaged roots and a poor looking plant and fertility deficiency. Again, in our part of the world and what we do, we get a lot of questions on fertilizers and fertility in alfalfa. And one of the things that was brought to my attention the other day was how, and this is going to be a very vague statement, so whoever's listening, don't be offended, but how often we have, I'm going to just say livestock producers that will put manure out ahead of their alfalfa and then make the decision that they have enough manure out there to carry that alfalfa stand for 4 years. And when you go back and evaluate 15,000 gallons of manure, you and I work in a very dairy populated area, but when you go back and run the fertility analysis backwards, there is not enough fertility in 15,000 gallons of dairy manure to last for 4 years to sufficiently supply that alfalfa stand to have a, I'm going to just say it vaguely, a non-limiting yield environment. People, we do need to address fertility. There are other parts of the country where, folks, we've different management systems for other crops, and I have seen potassium numbers less than 100 and phosphorus numbers less than 10, and that concerns me a lot. So, Randy, Please, let's
Yeah.
talk
So
just
yeah,
a little about fertility and
yeah.
fertilizer.
Let's just talk about fertilizer just a little bit. So alfalfa takes a lot of nutrients, and one of the reasons that we
Yes.
feed alfalfa to our ruminant animals is because it has a lot of nutrients in it. When you put alfalfa in a, and I've had beef producers tell me this over the years, is that if you have a herd of cows that you're having trouble getting it bred, or you're having some type of issue with your cows, many times what the old timers would say, just feed them some alfalfa. A lot of times your problems go away. Well, why is that? Because there's a nutrient or nutrients, or the set of nutrients that's in that alfalfa plant is obviously very beneficial to those animals. So if you don't have it in the soil, my point is you can't get it in the plant, right? So this whole thing about fertility is so important to get that done right. So the first nutrient we always like to talk about is soil potassium. Now,
Yes.
depending on where you are in the continental U.S., as we go east in the U.S., our potassium numbers tend to fall off geologically. As you go west in the U.S., geologically we have more potassium. So when you're talking about South Dakota and west, we have lots of
Yep.
potassium in the dirt. And then in the eastern U.S., we need to go somewhere, mine potassium out of the earth and haul it to those fields to replace or to build that potassium level up. So the rule of thumb I like to have you all think about is that we need 50 pounds of potassium replaced for every ton of forage you remove. Now think about that as if you have a 1-ton square bale sitting in your field as a grower, you think about that 1-ton big square bale sitting there. That's a 50-pound bag of potash sitting on top of that bale. The analogy is that think about how much potassium is being removed by every ton of alfalfa you're removing. Where we have good rainfall, we have good stands, we're taking off 5 to 6 tons of alfalfa. Do the math on that. 50, it doesn't take long to figure out you need about 500 pounds of potash, no, not just potassium, but potash, to replace those nutrients that you're removing from that soil. And that's the removal rate. That's not the building rate where you're getting at, Jeff, is that
Correct.
you may have pulled these levels down over the years, and now you need to put some what's called corrective on to get those K levels up to where they need to be. So potassium is a big deal, and that applies to all forages, which is in our livestock world, we have corn silage, we have oatlage, we have wheat straw, we have all these forage grass hay. We have all these forage materials that come off from our fields, and if you're not replacing potassium, then we may be hurting our yields of our alfalfa and other forage crops for that matter. So potassium is a big deal. And you mentioned something really interesting, Jeff. You said the soil test numbers. Once you drop below what I call the deadly doubles on
Yes.
potassium, it's bad news for alfalfa because your alfalfa yields just are not there. I think quite frankly, what happens in a lot of alfalfa growers' minds is their yields are not where they expect them to be, and I think many times it's because they're not managing potassium and the other fertility. The other one that you mentioned, and certainly in the western U.S., it's certainly a concern is geologically because our soils do not have much phosphorus in the western U.S., whereas in the eastern U.S., we have higher levels and more of a traditional dairy and livestock background where we have higher phosphorus numbers here in the east. But in the
Yes.
west, like you just said, when you get to single-digit phosphorus numbers, that's also bad news, right? So
Yes.
phosphorus is really important, and I see this happen quite often as I scout fields with our selling staff and with agronomists, where you see these strips going across the field where a manure spreader went probably 3, 4, 5 years ago. That's probably a phosphorus band where that end gate spreader spread manure, and you can see those strips in the field just plain as day, where those phosphorus levels are high and where there's higher, and where those phosphorus levels are low. So that whole P and K discussion is really, really important for alfalfa. The other pillar that I really want to talk about is soil pH. And you knew that's where I was going, Jeff. But soil pH is really important for alfalfa. Again, the audience in this potential listenership in this discussion, east and west. Again, the eastern U.S. we have trouble because of our higher rainfalls with low pH. In the western U.S., we don't worry about pHs as much just because we don't have the leaching of the bases like we would in the eastern U.S. So in the east, we want to put on limestone to get our soil pHs up into that 6.8 to 7.0 range. In the western U.S., we don't worry about that as much. However, some soil types, Jeff, in a lot of your
Yep.
areas, you can still have really low pHs.
Yes.
Grid testing can help us identify where those low pH areas are and get those corrected so we end up evening those alfalfa yields out. So So pH is really important. Limestone application is really important. The finer lime, of course, works faster. We need to put lime on a year or two, in many cases, a year or two ahead of time, because lime is not like fertilizer. Lime has to react with all the acid compounds that are in the soil, and that takes time and tillage and rainfall for that reaction to occur. And it's not like you're putting a fertilizer application on where once it goes into soil solution, it becomes available to the plant immediately. This is a reaction where it has to neutralize the acidity in the soil and become to do its good. It takes time to make that happen. So
It's definitely a planning process for this crop, Randy. It's not a knee-jerk reaction and everything will be just fine if we decide to do it tomorrow.
yeah.
Because, I mean, think about the discussions we've had where you talk about residual herbicides, you talk about especially this pH and lime. Those are decisions that you have to make a year, 2 years ahead of time to make this rotation be successful, I would say, or reduce the risk of having an issue. So 2 more things I want you to talk about quick: boron and sulfur, alfalfa.
Yeah. Sulfur is really important for this reason, is that it's important in protein production. So if you think about sulfur, how protein is basically made from phosphorus, nitrogen, and sulfur. So if you don't have sulfur, you're not going to have high levels. If you don't have adequate levels of sulfur, you're not going to have high levels of protein in your alfalfa potentially. So
Correct.
we want to make sure we're putting sulfur on. So sulfur used to fall out of the sky. We used to get with our high sulfur coals and diesel fuel, we used to get some sulfur out of the sky. So certainly in much of the U.S. around metropolitan areas, of course. But now with without having high sulfur in our fossil fuels, what's happened now is we do need to make sure we're adding adequate sulfur to our fertility programs. We need to be adding about 5 pounds of sulfate sulfur per ton of expected forage. And so that's where we come up with, if you have 5 to 6 tons of alfalfa, we roughly say 30 pounds of sulfate sulfur is the number that we kind of used over the last few years to make a recommendation on that. You're using ammonium sulfate, potassium sulfate, gypsum to be the other one. So you've got several sources of potassium, and you also have elemental sulfur. The one caution on elemental sulfur is kind of like the lime story. It may take a year or two for that to oxidize and be available. Now, we would not use elemental sulfur in a surface application. If you're using a starter type application, or you're spreading fertilizer ahead of your alfalfa application, then elemental sulfur works well. But it does need to be incorporated because it does need to oxidize or actually mineralize, break down in the soil. So we do not recommend surface spreading elemental sulfur. So, but sulfur is really important for protein, really important for high quality alfalfa. Want to make sure we're getting sulfur on it. Sulfur should be going in every time the potash spreader goes out and phosphorus spreader goes out. We should be putting some sulfur in with our applications for maximum yield and maximum quality. The other nutrient quickly here would be boron. Don't forget about boron. Boron in many situations now, and I get probably of my fertility trouble calls, I would say boron is right up there with guys saying, why is my alfalfa yellow? Why is it short? Why is it uneven? Why do I have these kind of spots in my fields? My plants look kind of weird. They look very compressed and very short. The inner nodes are compressed. That's a typical boron deficiency. They look kind of reddish sometimes in color, but that's a boron deficiency. And you'll see that happen really across all alfalfa growing areas, especially in the Midwest, where we may not have enough boron. A lot of situations, high rainfall. Boron does leach. I didn't mention this before, but sulfur and boron do leach, and so they do not stick around like phosphorus and potassium. So you do need to apply those annually or have a plan to apply them annually, because on coarse textured soils, you're basically pushing them through the profile. When you get a good rainfall, you are leaching them out over time. Boron does leach. There's 2 ways to put boron on. You can put boron on with your dry fertilizer material. You can spread it as a fertilizer borate, which has been the traditional way we apply somewhere between probably 1 pound to 2 pounds of actual boron with the potash, phosphorus fertilizers. And the other way we like to supplement our dry boron program is with a foliar boron. Foliar boron works really well because it's used in very small amounts. But in the summertime when it's hot and dry, what I like to recommend is when you spray your potato leafhoppers, you spray your other insects, make sure you put a little soluble boron. There's a product that we offer here at Winfield called Maxin Boron, which works really well for alfalfa. One of the highest levels of boron in concentration in the industry. It's very soluble, very available to the alfalfa plant. Works fantastic in our summer applications in that July and August time frame. Soil's hot, it's dry. You don't have a lot of soil solution going on in the top 3, 4, 5 inches of that soil. That alfalfa field's getting pretty dry. You want to give that a little extra boron for your third crop and fourth crop yield. That works really, really well for boron application. So that's the fertilizer discussion. The other quick things that maybe just mention here as we kind of wrap our discussion up today.
Sure.
Just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the value of forage right now. And so we see the trend right now as far as our dry conditions last summer are pushing the forage value, with the cost of everything and inflation and everything that you want to around those discussions. But the value of forage continues to be, quite high. And for any producers that have forage to sell, it's becoming more of a very valuable commodity on the farm. And so a lot of our producers that are looking for forage are struggling to find the forages that they need in some cases. But the value of that forage continues to increase. And I'm not particularly going to throw out any numbers here. You can do your own research on your value of forage. But I just want to mention that, we're at an all-time low in the inventories of forages in the U.S. right now, and that includes all of our dry hay stocks. Silage yields in the eastern U.S. were fairly decent because we get better rainfall, but the central and western U.S. were at really low forage stocks, which is a little bit concerning, not to have as much forages as we may need. So that means the value of these forages will continue to, in my opinion, will continue to increase.
Yep. I think as a complete U.S. look, Randy, you're correct. And I know darn well, if we had a phone call with somebody from all 48 states, somebody's going to say, oh, we had pretty decent moisture this year. We're okay. And our forage production next year, we can slack off a little bit. But I would bet that 80% is going to say, we're short or not caught up. Yes, absolutely. So for those people that need that forage production, we all need the great forage production. So hopefully we provided some good tips, topics, ideas, thoughts. We probably didn't cover everybody's need, but if we can take what we had for a discussion today and get people to think more completely about their forage program and the alfalfa production in particular, I think this is a great discussion this morning. And it all started out with, hey, should we be seeding this stuff in the middle of winter? Not really a good idea.
Not a good idea.
All this stuff all ties together. So, Randy, I want to thank you for your time this morning. It's been a great conversation, and everybody have a great day.
Yep. Thank you, Jeff.